Right. So the Marine Life Protection Act was actually one piece of a larger piece of legislation that ultimately was divided into two pieces. One piece became the Marine Life Management Act, which is our fisheries management law here in California, and the other piece became the Marine Life Protection Act, which was the marine protected areas component of as a complement to fisheries management. MLPA is intended to primarily protect living marine resources, although the way MPAs are defined, cultural and geological resources are also protected, but the primary focus is on living marine resources, and there are 6 specific goals that the Act requires be accomplished through a redesigned system of marine protected areas. So California already had lots of marine protected areas when the law was passed, but they were designed over about a 70-plus year period of time, haphazardly. There was no rhyme or reason to the system as a whole. It didn't function as a system. There were just MPAs, different pieces. Some were small, some were a little bit larger. They had multiple purposes and objectives. Some didn't have any objectives or goals that could be identified, et cetera. So MLPA basically said, go back, redesign that system, use science, the best readily available science, to do that redesign effort, as well as the input of scientists, stakeholders, and experts on the marine environment and these areas that you're examining, and redesign it so that it achieves these 6 goals.
And what are who are the stakeholders that helped redesign? And
so the group of stakeholders was different for each region. The coast was divided into 4 study regions, the open coast, and then San Francisco Bay was the 5th region. The stakeholder group for each of those study regions was specific to that region, so there was no overlap among the regional stakeholder groups. And the types of interests that were represented were everything from commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, divers, surfers, managing agencies, other state and federal agencies, harbor masters, general public. So it was a really broad array of individuals and interests, of folks who use the ocean environment.
Awesome. And so what aspects of the Act have worked well? Has it been extremely effective, and you're not finding that people are entering these areas, or I know you're not doing enforcement, but have there been little things that you've heard down the...
Yeah, so I haven't really been involved in the management, the monitoring, the management, enforcement, etc. And so folks with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California State Parks, the MPA Monitoring Enterprise, there's a separate organization in California that helps lead the monitoring effort and developing monitoring plans and programs for each of these regions. Those folks are better suited to answer that kind of question. And then we have groups that are being established within each region with, again, stakeholders and managing agencies working together to identify how best to implement and manage these MPAs in each study region.
And so it sounds like a really amazing aspect that a lot of acts, when they're drafted, that you guys took into account was the stakeholders, and that you're really including them in the commentary and making sure that they're written into their interests and the Act are aligned. And it sounds like that's something amazing that they accomplished.
Yeah, to the extent possible. The design of this system of MPAs really came from the stakeholders. They used the science guidelines developed by the scientists to design the various MPAs, and there was a lot of negotiation and give and take back and forth among the stakeholders about where MPAs would be established, and we had data that was gathered relative to commercial and recreational fishing activities, so that to the extent possible, the stakeholders, as they were designing the system, could avoid those areas that were really important to either commercially or recreationally for fishing activities. So there was a lot of, one, the system was designed by the stakeholders, and 2, definitely the stakeholders made every effort possible to take into account the interests of other stakeholders participating in the process.
Perfect. What were some of the biggest challenges you saw when you're putting this together? I'm sure getting everyone together in a room, and you said that you had some groups as large as 50 plus people. I mean, that must be a huge challenge, those, and then getting other agencies. I don't know if federal, if you had to deal with anything federal, or if you had immense struggles with federal departments, things like that, or getting just state agencies to work together to allow this to happen.
As far as the federal agencies, they were really, really helpful, active participants, very cooperative, helped us with identifying data, helped with negotiating some of the outcomes and specific MPAs. Some of the federal agencies are actually managing some of those ocean resources, so their staff are very knowledgeable and brought a lot of information and data to the process. So great relationship there. With the other state agencies, same thing, also very positive contributors. I think our stakeholders did a really good job of learning to work together. You know, initially when you bring a group of diverse interests like that together, there's in some cases some distrust, and I think that's in large part just not understanding what the interests are, fully understanding the interests and the desired outcomes of the other interests at the table. And so we spent a lot of time trying to help folks understand what is it that's important to me, and what is it that's important to the other stakeholders at the table, and can we find common ground? In some cases, it was just unlearning some of the misperceptions or misunderstandings about what others wanted or needed, because oftentimes folks are focused on a specific outcome and not paying close attention to what is the real need, what is it that outcome will help me achieve. And if we can step back and look at what it is that we're trying to achieve, perhaps there's a different outcome that can still help us achieve that. And so that was a really big part of the planning process, was again helping everyone understand one another's interests and trying to take a step back and identify, can we find an outcome that meets those interests, that's not specifically what you might have imagined originally.
And you were also telling me you've watched this take shape. And can you tell me about that again? Watching, going from gathering the science and working with scientists and, some of the amazing components that have really gone into this. Can you tell me about that process again?
Sure. So what I had shared with you previously was that I was a staff member at the California Natural Resources Agency back in the 1990s when we did a series of workshops up and down the coast to identify what are some of the ocean and coastal issues that are really pressing, that need to be addressed by the state of California. And the outcome of that process was a book, the California Ocean Resources Management Plan. And one of the things that we had identified in that plan was the need to take another look at California's protected areas along the coast, because at that time we had 18 different classifications that were being used to describe these various areas. And as I described before, some of them, the resource managers couldn't even tell us what is the primary purpose for this area, what is the objective, or what is the goal that you're trying to achieve. And the public had identified it as a problem as well, because they didn't understand what's the difference between a reserve, a preserve, and a natural area. Wow, that's a good question. So from that, we identified the need to reassess that nomenclature and that system. The Marine Managed Areas Improvement Act was the result of that effort, piece of legislation that redesigned the classification or naming system that was used from 18 down to 6. And then MLPA said of those 6, we're going to use 3 or 4 of those classifications to design a new network of marine protected areas based around these 6 goals. So I had the opportunity to see the problem defined, resulting legislation that said, okay, here's how we're going to fix that, and then to actually participate in the process where we said, all right, well, if these are the 6 goals that we're trying to achieve, how do we do that? What does the science tell us is the best way to achieve that? And so bringing the scientists, the groups of scientists together, asking that question, they developed a series of guidelines that were very specific to each of those goals. And then following that, we bring the stakeholders together using those guidelines to begin identifying areas along the coast that meet those criteria, and how do we piece them together that makes most sense. Again, having as minimal impact as possible on important commercial and recreational fishing areas. And then ultimately delivering recommendations to the California Fish and Game Commission of here's what the stakeholders and the scientists think will work for this particular region. And we ultimately did that for all 4 study regions, and the commission ultimately adopted redesigned MPAs in all 4 of those study regions.
Thanks.